Partners Pennoni, but I will be back again next week.
Jeremy, just testing that you can still hear me.
We can all hear you there, don't worry. I still make it that we've got 2 minutes to go till 3 o'clock. More and more people arriving.
Just for everyone who has already signed in benefit, we're just going to wait till 3 to commence. Thank you for your patience.
I see some of our regular friends from America are starting to arrive. You're all very welcome. Please feel free at any time to use the question facility to send questions in. Me and Zia will attempt to answer them as they arrive. Otherwise, we'll have a question and answer session at the end where we'll catch up on them all. Welcome, Rick from Buffalo. We'll just give it 1 more minute before we get going. Good morning, Teresa from Buffalo as well. If anybody else wants to put a shout in the question box as where they're from and good morning or good afternoon, they're more than welcome. Okay, we're just about ready to start. Welcome, Rob from Utrecht in the Netherlands. We do have a very multinational audience again. This webinar is becoming a global phenomenon. Okay, I think it's time to get started. I know some people will be joining shortly afterwards, but let's get going because we've got a lot to get through as always, and I do like to try and finish on time. So, as I've said to people who've been on for a short while already, I'm Jeremy, your regular presenter. I'll be back again next week, but for this week we have a special guest speaker, Zia Uller from Pennoni, a solicitors company that we've been a proud partner of for some time now. Our legal professionals from Pennoni and the technical specialists from SQA Consulting have been working together for some time on sanctions now, delivering a sort of whole picture for you. Today we're going to hear more from the legal regulatory aspects of sanctions rather than the technical stuff that we've been covering in the first 3 webinars. But right now I'm going to hand you straight over to Zia, who's going to take you through the rest of the day. Thank you, Zia.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you to everyone that's joined us for today's session. I know this is a session 4 of a 6-session seminar briefing pack that SQA have put on, and I've got to say that the content of what's been delivered so far and what will be delivered in the future is I think a must attend for anyone who has to deal with sanctions on a day-to-day basis. Just a little bit of background about who I am. As Jeremy kindly said, my name is Zia Uller. I'm a partner at Pennoni, based in the north of England in Manchester, and also on a weekly basis in London. I am a financial crime specialist and was formerly the global head of sanctions for Barclays, and also responsible for their group policies on anti-money laundering and anti-bribery and corruption, and now a member of the Financial Conduct Authority's Skilled Persons Panel for Financial Crime. Today's session is essentially a very brief walkthrough, and for those of you that don't like hearing or speaking to lawyers, I'm sure happy to hear that, but I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough at a canter on some recent updates to essentially EU bracket UK and US sanctions, and some of the potential impact for institutions. I used to say doing these training sessions, financial institutions. Obviously, the scope of international sanctions in today's world means that it's not just financial institutions that these sanctions are impacting. So, moving swiftly on, as Jeremy has outlined, we are working to a pretty strict timetable, although I know that there is time for plenty of questions after I've gone through my part of the session. So feel free not only to ask questions during the webinar, but also after if so needed. I have provided some detailed slides, as you will see over the next few slides. Please don't start killing yourself straight away. I'm not going to read the slides in any great detail. They're there for reference and there for people to refer to if they need to at a later date. And as you'll probably see, we don't have time to go through every single aspect of the changes that have happened. So I'm just going to do a very brief overview of updates to regimes within the EU and UK, and just go into a little bit of detail on one particular area and aspect to those regimes, focusing on Iran. And no surprise that that will also be my area of focus for the US updates as well. So within the EU, as with in many jurisdictions, there have been very many changes to sanctions regimes over the past 6, 12, 18 months. Some are very high profile, such as Iran and Syria, some less so, but equally important. From an EU perspective, we've seen the ratcheting up of sanctions against Iran, in which I will go into more detail shortly. But we've also seen, as a result of the Arab Spring, some changes made to the regimes with respect to Syria. So the Syrian sanctions have now been extended to 2014. They were due to last until the end of this year, but extended to the end of next year now. Also, importantly, seen the removal of sanctions. Very rare that we see that, but we have in relation to Burma and Myanmar, as a result of the political negotiations that have taken place with the regime there. It's going to be interesting to see how that impacts financial institutions from a practical perspective. I think it's I won't say very easy. It's easier, in my view, to switch off your trade with a jurisdiction that has been sanctioned. I'm not so sure about the challenges about switching that back on again, and you know, how stable that country will be in the short to medium term, which is obviously what financial institutions and other industrial companies look for when considering investment. Although, having seen some of that activity, it seems that some people have been preparing for the removal of sanctions against Burma and Myanmar for some time now. We've also seen, quite importantly and significantly, a reduction in the sanctions against Zimbabwe. Importantly, though, from an EU perspective, they still remain in place against the key members of ZANU-PF, including Robert Mugabe and his immediate circle of advisors. And then, lastly, but by no means least, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, otherwise known as North Korea. Interesting, and I put this down because we were seeing if not a reduction, but talk of a reduction in the sanctions against DPRK, both from a US and EU perspective. But obviously, given what's happened in the last 6 months, that is no longer likely. And in fact, we're probably going to see, we have seen a strengthening of those sanctions again. Again, highlighting with a link to Burma, Myanmar there, what can happen where the potential political reconciliation falls foul of mood swings from one jurisdiction. So I'm going to just briefly, from an EU and UK perspective, just concentrate on the most important regulation for us within the European Union and as a consequence for anyone in the UK. And I've listed the regulation numbers there, but it doesn't really make any difference ultimately. These are just the latest regulations that have superseded the original regulations that were imparted against Iran, probably in most detail back in 2010. But the current EU sanctions against Iran build upon your traditional economic sanctions and what we historically have known as asset freezes, and go beyond that into other areas which we are also seeing, which we have seen in the United States, with a particular emphasis on the energy sector. So prohibition on dealing with Iranian crude oil, petroleum, petrochemical products, energy sector products, liquid natural gas, and also precious metals, stones, currency, etc. So in the EU, we saw this happening towards the end of last year, really, this sort of ratcheting up into different sectors against Iran. As with most of the Iranian sanctions, and in common with most sanctions regimes, we still have a designated person SDN type list of individuals and entities, and that includes IRISL and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, etc. But we also have within our EU restrictions some relatively complex rules around what can and can't be done in terms of transfers to and from Iran, even when they don't involve designated individuals or entities. Again, I'm not going to go through those in any great detail. I've put them on the slides for you. But essentially, there's a notification and approval regime in place within the EU. We've also seen a restriction in the availability of finance projects, in insurance and reinsurance, and I suspect one of the most controversial things to have happened in relation to Iran was the restriction placed upon SWIFT to enable SWIFT keys to be provided to Iranian financial institutions. Within the current EU restrictions, we see the importation of Iranian oil into the EU banned, the purchase of Iranian-originated carbon products and petroleum products, crude oil banned, the transportation of that, the financing in relation to it all also banned, excuse me. Importantly, and I suspect one of the things that many people seem to overlook is the extraterritorial nature of the EU sanctions. So with respect to nationals of the EU, these regulations extend no matter where they are. So many people wrongly assume that just because they're not within the EU, although they are of EU origin, or one of the EU jurisdictions, they'll be okay. And so I've just put down there an example of something that would fall foul of these regulations potentially and could cause problems. So we have a UK national just facilitating a transfer between two third-party jurisdictions of Iranian origin oil under the EU regulations. That is forbidden and prohibited, and they would be contravening the regulation. We also see within the regulation the provision of loans and credit being restricted, buying of shares or joint ventures with Iranian financial institutions also restricted, and even this loosely termed cooperation with projects involving Iranian natural gas or liquefied natural gas transmission also being restricted. I've listed just there from a UK perspective what our current regulations are in terms of the European Union restrictions. The reason why the UK, and as will any other European jurisdiction, has to implement its own sanctions related to the European Union is to implement any criminal penalties with respect to breaches of the regulations. So the EU, although having power to directly implement regulations across every jurisdiction within the EU, they can't do so. They can't implement criminal penalties. That is left to the host state to implement. So these are the various orders that implement the criminal penalties in the UK. So that was, as I say, a very brief look at some of the most important elements of the Iranian sanctions, both from an EU and UK perspective. And again, dare I say it, but of more interest to many people has been the implementation of enhanced and further sanctions in the US. And I think it's not unjustified to call it now the Iranian minefield, because there have just been simply a plethora of regulations stroke primary laws implemented within the US, all relating to Iran, some coinciding with other jurisdictions like Syria, but in terms of the Iranian regime, far from becoming clearer as to what you could and couldn't do. In my view, it's become far more complex because, as I said earlier on in the presentation, we've gone beyond just simply the targeting of, firstly, US financial institutions, then US-based financial institutions, over to foreign financial institutions, and then foreign institutions full stop. So again, I'm not going to detail every single one of these particular bits of legislation for you, but we have the Iran Sanctions Act, the main precursor, the Comprehensive Iranian Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act of 2010, CISADA or PISADA. We've had a couple of National Defense Authorization Acts that are normally used for implementing military budgets, but have been used to sneak in inverted commas, a few very critical Iranian-based sanctions regimes. We have the Iranian Threat Reduction and Syria Human Rights Act as well. And then just very recently, in terms of implementation, i.e. the 1st of July, we've had the Iran Freedom and Counter-Proliferation Act, which again has ratcheted up the sanctions against foreign institutions beyond the normal economic and financial transactions we've seen previously. I just thought it's worth, I can't shift that out of the way so you can see this hopefully. The last bullet on the right hand side, Executive Order 13599, I think it's worth mentioning that because historically when US firms were asked to deal with any Iranian-linked payment, they would historically have had to just simply reject it and make a report they had done so to OFAC. But that executive order implemented a straight-out blocking regime. So where you weren't dealing with an SDN on the list or any other party exempted by the SDN list, you were just simply told to reject payments. But that executive order implemented a straight-out blocking, and we know that as in the EU or UK as a freezing regime. So just to go through a few of the most important elements of the US legislation against Iran, very briefly again. Well, CISADA was really the first element of the ability of the US government to target foreign financial institutions in particular, and it was focused on weapons proliferation and the nuclear industry. And so anyone where they were viewed as assisting the WM deproliferation industry or engage in activities connected to such, or, and again this is where some controversy was caused, assisting the Central Bank of Iran with such, they were liable to sanctions. And these sanctions were in particular where these following amounts were provided in relation to the production or procurement of or importation of petroleum products over a 12-month period in relating to Iran's domestic energy sector also. The sanctions were interesting in that they're not, the sanctions provided for under CISADA are not your typical, and I put in typical inverted commas, sanctions. They provided for restrictions in the ability of US firms to provide services to foreign financial institutions. So they weren't strictly SDN types, if I can call it that, type restrictions. And in fact, we've only seen 2 institutions sanctioned under that regime, and you can find that on what's called the Part 561 list. They're not found on the SDN list. They're not subject to a typical asset freeze. These institutions, which were Bank of Kunlun and Elaf Bank. Bank of Kunlun is a Chinese institution, Elaf Bank an Iraqi institution. Those institutions were, and I say were for good reason, subject to restrictions on the ability of US firms to provide them with services, as opposed to a straight-out asset freeze against them. Elaf Bank has had its restrictions recently lifted against it, so it's okay now from that sense. Moving on, we then saw the National Defence Authorization Act for fiscal years, well actually it was 11, 12 and 13 ultimately, but again we saw sanctions, the ability of OFAC to sanction foreign financial institutions, and again ratcheting up here we see foreign central banks or state-owned entities also included in the definition of who could be sanctioned. So where they were engaging any activities with IFIs, where they were dealing with the CBI, again we see the facilitation of petroleum and energy products, they were liable to sanctions, and it was a focus really on the central banks here. Now, as many of you may recall, there was a great deal of chat about these particular sanctions, and these the NDA provided for what were called exemptions from sanctions for those jurisdictions that were able to show that they were either not going to engage in the purchase of Iranian oil purchases, or they were going to greatly reduce the amount of oil being purchased. And so, as I've listed some of the countries that were initially granted exemptions under these sanctions, that list has now increased in size as well. And finally, I suspect, so in terms of the latest set of changes from the US in relation to Iran, we see the Iran Freedom and Counter-Proliferation Act of 2012. And again, we've seen some further targeting not only of financial transactions, but again, an expansion into other activity, a very focused expansion as well, so looking specifically at the Iranian rial, and also, again, very interestingly, Iran's automotive sector has been targeted. And it actually was a surprise to me to see that Iran's automotive sector actually accounted for 10% of its gross domestic product in the last fiscal year. So it's a very, very large sector and industry for Iran. So the targeting of this is not insignificant at all. I've listed the biggest manufacturer, Iran Khodro, and it's not just a domestic production issue for them, because Iran Khodro actually is a mass exporter of vehicles into Southeast Asia. So I think that there is the real potential for these sanctions to impact those involved in those sectors. What's interesting from the IFCP perspective in relation to the automotive sector is it doesn't apply to finished vehicles, not finished, but finished vehicles. So any manufacturer, sort of your Peugeots, your Mercedes-Benz of this world, are still able to transact because they will be exporting into Iran finished motor vehicles. What these sanctions are targeting are the export into Iran of automotive materials, essentially. So materials used by the domestic producers to build vehicles. There are some exemptions to that, but I think it's important to note that because, again, there's a lot of talk about the fact that it's going to cause great chaos to particularly the EU automotive sector, because a large number, particularly of French, Peugeot in particular, French and Renault, Peugeot and Renault in particular, manufacturers would have been greatly impacted by a full ban into Iran of automotive parts related to their vehicles. So we've just seen a very sort of brief look at some of the recent updates to regimes, and I suspect of most interest to people are to talk about and talk to the challenges that those sanctions present to you within your legal and compliance functions or whatever risk function you sit in. And I suspect, for looking outside in now, but as I have contemplated what this would have meant had I still be sat in my chair at level 28 at 1 Churchill Place, the challenges are just unending. Not having to focus purely on payments and customers and trade finance as examples within the financial institution was a challenge enough. The increasing focus on the other sectors that these sanctions, both from an EU and US perspective, are bringing means that there can only be an ever-burdening shift of compliance from a sanctions perspective on all parts of your FI's business and other businesses as well. So not only the financial institution themselves, but their clients in particular. And the focus has expanded to shipping in particular, energy, oil and gas, the extractive industries, but also precious metals and IT. And as I just said, from an Iranian perspective, also into the automotive sector as well. And there's an increasing expectation by the regulators, whether they're based here or within the US or internationally as well. Jurisdictions like Australia, Canada in particular, Singapore, to fully understand the client-customer activity. So not only building their own systems and understanding their own systems are fit for purpose to maintain vigilance over the sanctions compliance challenge, but also to understand what their clients and customers are doing as well. That the burden is being shifted, and many people have complained for a number of years now about this. The police type activity that FIs are having to undertake. Well, it's going to increase ever more, in my opinion, and we see that by some of the advisories that have been published by people like, OFAC, and actually this is where OFAC actually has to be praised, because at least OFAC is providing advisories about what people should and should not be doing in terms of their activity with particular regimes. I think one of the criticisms one can level at an EU level and UK level as well is the amount of advice that is provided, the number of FAQs that are provided in relation to our regimes. It's, I think, woefully inadequate, and I think OFAC deserves some credit. It might be a very harsh regime, sometimes very difficult to understand, but it does try and provide detailed information in different languages now as well, which is to be commended. Other challenges are that we're seeing that the evasion techniques are becoming far more sophisticated across the board, and we see that particularly in areas like export controls and trade finance in particular, where the underlying activity might be shielded from the FI along the way, and there's ever more focus on the FI, understanding it not just from a screening perspective at customer take on or at payment execution or delivery of documentation, but actually all the way through a particular transaction. So what about the future? What are we going to see in relation to sanctions compliance? Well, I think, as I've mentioned, we're going to see a greater emphasis on people conducting due diligence throughout the course of a relationship with their customers and clients. And I coined a phrase a while back, so-called that intelligence-led due diligence. So not just reliance on your commercial providers, but also making sure that your teams, internal teams, are all sort of hooked up and linked in together in relation to what's going on. And we're seeing a convergence, and not only do I mean this from a sanctions perspective, so we were seeing a convergence in terms of a focus, for example, on Iran, a convergence and approach in terms of sectors, etc. One could argue that we're now diverging away because of the complexity of the US regime in particular, but we're also seeing a convergence in terms of financial crime risk, and we have to look at sanctions risk with our other financial crime spectacles on as well, so ABC, anti-bribery and corruption, and also anti-money laundering, and PEPs as well, politically exposed persons. So we see a convergence of all financial crime risk, with particularly sanctions now taking a major place at the heart of that overall risk mitigation strategy. And then I suppose finally, from my view, we also see the interconnectivity of political risk. I suppose many people would say, well, it's obvious, isn't it, that sanctions are linked to political risk, but I think actually if we look back over a number of years, the ability or the within certain groups, within institutions, ability to link what was going on politically out in the outside real world with what may happen in terms of financial institution risk and op risk, etc., was sort of overlooked. I think many more institutions are becoming much more savvy of the fact that they need to have their political crystal balls in front of them to understand where the next jurisdictions might be in terms of potential sanctions, potential changes to regimes, and what might happen in terms of their risk from a sanctions perspective. And again, no greater example of that do we see in terms of what that looks like than Egypt, where we've seen it part of the Arab Spring, we've seen a potential respite, and then we see it heading back to political chaos again, and again potential for that to have an impact at the financial institution level from a sanctions perspective. That's all I wanted to say in relation to my part of the webinar. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone that's joined us for this brief update session. I hope it's been of use. Please do feel free to ask questions of me or Jeremy if you feel the need to, and I'm sure I will be speaking to you again hopefully at some point in the future.
Okay, thank you, Zia. That was great. I'm going to keep Zia here for as long as it takes to get through all your questions. Now, it's not often we get a legal professional offering their services for free, so make the most of it. Start getting some questions in, or if you just want his opinion on something, just put something in the question box and we'll see what we can get. Also, if you'd like to hear Zia again speak on other things, give us some feedback. There's plenty of scope for things like PEPs, bribery and corruption. Let me know what you want to hear about. Okay, so let's have some questions, please. Nobody going to volunteer the first question?
I've depressed everyone enough, Jeremy. I think they can't believe their obligations now.
Okay, we've got a question from Sam Walker. Thank you, Zia. Very informative. Is there a UN consolidated list? I think I'd probably best place to say that. There is a UN consolidated list, or rather there's lots of UN consolidated lists. There's a consolidated list for all the Al-Qaeda sanctions, and there's a separate one for the Taliban sanctions, and then there's 6 or 7 other ones. So there's no individual, there's no overall all of UN consolidated list, but there are individual for each Security Council subcommittee consolidated lists. Okay, so Rob is asking what tooling would you use to apply the sanctions checks? So I'm the expert at tooling, but Zia is the expert at knowing what the regulatory viewpoint about tooling is. So let's get his perspective on tooling for sanctions.
I can't actually see the question, Jeremy. Can you help me with
the question is what tooling would you use to apply the sanctions checks? So let's hear it from a regulatory perspective. What do the regulators stipulate?
So it's a good question, Rob. Thank you for it. I mean, essentially, none of the regulators will actually expressly say anywhere that you are obliged to use any type of system to comply with sanctions. But actually, from a practical perspective, everyone knows that the only way you can is by screening. So you screen using whatever service you choose to utilize, whether that's a commercial provider or you choose to just go to the actual regulators themselves and see who's on their particular list. And that manual process is utilized by many small to medium-sized enterprises. For a larger enterprise, obviously that's impossible when you're having to screen upwards of 40 million customers in Barclays' case and hundreds of thousands of payments a day. You could never achieve that from a manual perspective. So how companies like Barclays and other international companies choose to comply is by screening, utilizing software that they implement into their payment and other terrible feedback, into their data systems, and that's
muted.
You can do so. Again, the regulators are quick to point out that if you are using that type of those types of software, that you've got to make sure it's fit for purpose. So again, although not obligated in law or regulation, they will, as RBS found out to its cost, look at what you are doing as an institution to make sure that if you are utilising that type of screening software, that it's fit for purpose. And I think Jeremy could sort of give you some of the quick and dirty issues that arise that people fall foul of. Jeremy?
Can we mention some examples of screening software? Sure. I mean, Burgersoft are probably the market leader, but LexisNexis, Norcom, Oracle, many others. Some people have built their own still, although more and more people are going to vendors to supply it. But anybody who supplies any kind of AML product normally has a sanction screening part to their product on the side of it. So lots and lots, and the ones we've looked at all have very similar performance. Question from David. What areas in financial institutions need to work more closely together to achieve best practice in sanctions monitoring? Zia?
That's a great question, actually. It goes to the heart of the last point I was trying to make, and I suppose it depends on what sort of institution you're looking at, really. You know, in the larger global type organisation, we've got to get to a position of much greater what I again coined collaborative compliance, and I don't just mean that compliance people are working together there. I mean collaboration across a business, from your business facing colleagues, but also actually much greater buy-in from senior management. I think there's been a lot of talk about the fact that senior management need to be brought into compliance from any particular angle. But from a sanctions perspective in particular, we've seen that the fines have been so great that I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding by people at the board level as to what this all means and what the challenges are. And actually, I think that the buy-in has to start there, and you've got to show your board, and the board have to be shown that this is really serious, and getting it wrong is really serious. And I still think that even after all the large-scale fines that we've seen, that many boards don't get it or haven't got it. I know some have, and they've sanctioned, apologies using that phrase, but sanctioned multi, in some cases, £1 billion spends in relation to compliance now. But I think that's where it starts for any institution.
Okay, we have not so much a question, but a point from Nicholas, who said, while screening is necessary, it needs to be fully understood that due diligence and staff awareness is, if not just important, more important at times than screening. Just because something doesn't alert doesn't mean we can get away with it. I think in the previous webinars we've looked at some examples of that, where we've looked at PEPs and we've looked at due diligence supplementing the screening process. Thank you for that point, Nicholas. All these points and questions will be published later with full answers from me and Zia. Okay, so we have a question from Rick. In the US, we receive FinCEN Section 314A information requests bi-weekly, but now include international individuals and entities which direct effect of the US Patriot Act. Do any other countries have similar types of information requests? Zia?
In short, the answer is yes. So in the UK, as an example, an institution could receive notifications or information requests under various bits of legislation, and it depends on what you're looking at. From a sanctions perspective, for example, if you reported in that you'd frozen an account, etc., that normally triggers further requests from Treasury. Her Majesty's Treasury for information as to how the account has been conducted or transacted. That could then also lead to the involvement of the police or other regulators if a criminal investigation is commenced. So yes, I mean, the short answer is yes, they do have the powers. It just varies depending on what you're looking at.
We've got another question from Rob. Do you have any examples of sanctions-related fines, juicy details, and gossip? Oh dear, I think we have to be very careful with gossip there.
No, Jeremy and I definitely don't gossip. Jeremy and I definitely don't gossip. Yeah, well, I mean, there've been some very, very high-profile ones. So obviously, the most recent have been HSBC. We've seen them hit by, combined with the money laundering, excess of $1 billion fine. My former home, Barclays, was hit with a $298 million fine. Standard Chartered, in excess of $300 million in total fine. There are numerous examples of big fines. We don't see that the similar sort of figures elsewhere, if I'm honest. So within the UK, the sort of largest fine to date from that perspective has been on RBS, less than, I can't remember the exact figure now, but it was around £10 million for failures in its systems and controls from a regulatory perspective. So yeah, I mean, it does impact the bottom line. There is no doubt to these large financial institutions, and we're going to see more coming out of the woodwork in the next 12 to 18 months. And we're going to see some big fines coming out against the insurance companies, I'm led to believe. That's the gossip I can tell you.
I think I'm a bit short on gossip at the moment, but I have heard that the South African regulator is starting to get very strong and will be applying fines through sub-Saharan Africa to those companies operating there, of which there's quite a few. It's the sort of financial powerhouse of Africa. Okay, another question from David. Which CXOs, I like that terminology, which CXOs in financial institutions should be most concerned with getting sanctions monitoring right?
CXOs?
Yes, CEOC, FOC, IOC, AO.
I actually think that it's got to be the CEO. It's got to be the guy or gal right at the top that has to be most worried about it. And again, we saw that with both the HSBC and Standard Chartered debacles in the most recent past, because ultimately the board are going to sort of stop at his door to say what was happening because it's on his watch. I mean, I think it's arguable to say that actually a fair few people fell on their swords in those particular cases to ensure that the CEOs in those particular cases weren't the people sort of facing the wrath ultimately. But I know from past experience that the regulators do call upon CEOs to come and explain what exactly has been going on and why it's gone on their watch. So I think that's I'm sure if they had a conflab between themselves, they could share some great war stories about just what how hard their knuckles have been wrapped by the regulators individually, and I think that that message is becoming clearer. But I think it still needs to go across the board. And I think what the CEOs then have to do is make sure that they have complete and utter buy-in from their senior management and their senior leadership teams across individual parts of the business. So into the CTOs, CIOs, and CAOs of their businesses to understand that the risk crosses all aspects of the business.
Well, I'll ask a further question about that, because it always used to be the MLRO that was sort of the nominated scapegoat for a company in this. There's a change of attitude recently that there's more sort of personal responsibility at the higher level of the company? Or would you say that's always been the case?
No, I think actually you're absolutely right. I think historically, and in the UK in particular, if you look at the UK, the MLRO is the fall guy in terms of anti-money laundering legislation. So it's on his shoulders there. But the MLRO isn't the fall guy when it comes to sanctions compliance, strictly because because it's not the same. They're not the same type of obligation ultimately. And so you do see that in relation to that and ABC as well, that although they don't deflect responsibility, actually the regulator doesn't appear to have been as interested as making the MLRO the fall guy as making the institution or the senior management of the four guy or gals in whatever institution you're looking at. So yeah, I'd agree with you, Jeremy, that we are definitely seeing a shift away from the ability of senior managers to go, well, I had no idea about this. It was my MLRO that was responsible, or my head of financial crime, or my head of AML, whoever it may be, and we're seeing it actually the buck stop with them.
Okay, we've got a question from Marjorie. When you don't work in the banking industry, and even though there have been big fines in banking, how do you balance the cost of implementing the screening system against the positive matches? There's probably going to be none that we will find. Well, yes, it is always going to be a balance, but I wouldn't say there's probably none that you'll find. There are a lot of SCNs out there, and I have seen a number of organisations who have found large numbers of SCNs in their customer base. But Zia.
No, I tend to agree. I think you're right. I mean, even in smaller, as I say, financial institutions, it's difficult to sometimes justify that cost. But even in the UK in particular, even the smaller institutions are finally getting the message that you know, the fact that it was expensive won't wash. So I think that outside the financial sector, particularly global corporations, there's no excuse. Now I know that, you know, within the extractive industry, as an example, they do implement screening at great cost, I might add, but they do. I think the challenge, as you've probably identified, is, you know, what do you do when you're not a global institution? What do you do when you're a small to medium type enterprise not involved in sort of payments or sort of typical sort of daily customer screening, etc. And I suspect it just depends on what sector you're in and what your customer base looks like. And again, I think that's where you can always tie in other financial crime bracket regulatory stroke legal risk, and you can I think mitigate that risk collectively when you're looking at a solution. That might be a commercial screening solution. It probably isn't in most cases. It's more about what you do from a due diligence perspective on the people you're doing business with. And I think that's where you probably want to make the greatest investment, where you're not having to deal with sort of your typical payment type, customer type screening.
Okay, we've got a very quick and easy one to answer from Wenny. Where are you going to publish these Q&As? We'll write them up and we'll send them to you individually in emails. Jason Story, who facilitated this event, will be organising that. And a question from Rob: can a bank outsource the screening to a supplier as a screening as a service type solutions? So I've certainly seen people do this, so it certainly can be done. I think an additional part of that is how can you delegate the responsibility of it ultimately? Well, let's have Zia's opinion.
No. That wasn't no to my opinion.
So, no, you can't delegate. So I've certainly seen a few organisations do this. There are people who will take this off your hands and do it for you, but I think the answer is it's still, you can't take the responsibility away from yourself by saying I'll give it to them, it's their fault if it goes wrong. I think still ultimately it's going to be your responsibility. So any more questions? There's still quite a number of you on the webinar still. I mean, thank you for staying on so long. We'll take any questions you've got. This is your big opportunity. So I'll just give you a few seconds more because there's no outstanding questions at the moment. I must say thank you for all the questions. There's been some very good questions. Well, thank you, Marjorie, and thank you, Samuel. I'm sorry, I called you Sam earlier. I don't know whether that's something you like or don't like. And sorry for anybody's name I mispronounce. Any more questions? Well, all that remains is for me to thank Zia for his contribution today, and thank you all for your questions and for listening. I hope to speak to you all again very soon, next week, in fact, when it's CTRP. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marjorie. Oh, I've just got a couple of questions more. Wenny, how often the sanctions list will be updated? Well, I think on average you get a sanctions list update between once a week and once a fortnight. It's a little slower lately, but when the Arab Spring was in full force, we were seeing them very quick, very frequent updates. But I think average over time is probably about one update a fortnight. Thank you, Rob. Sorry to hear you can't see the next presentation. If you speak to Jason, he can always arrange another session for you. So, any more? Okay, I'll just give it a few seconds and I'll close down the webinar. See, there's less and less of you here. Okay, I think it's time to close down. Thank you very much for your contribution, the ones that stayed, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Okay, thank you, Zia.